So it looks like it's almost 5, so we'll go ahead and get started. So hi, welcome. My name is Rupi Sureshkumar, and I'm a program manager on Azure Pack on bringing Azure technologies to your data center. It's been a long day. It's Cinco de Mayo, so big thank you to all for being here at 5 p.m. To come hear about this. In terms of what we're going to be doing today, an agenda. So at the beginning, we'll talk about exactly what is database as a service, and we'll even talk about what is the Azure Pack, as I know not everyone is familiar with that piece of technology. After that, we'll get into the experience of a tenant coming into Azure Pack and actually creating a database, managing that database, et cetera. And then we'll take a step back and say, okay, now we saw that experience. What did it take for the administrator to pair Azure Pack with SQL Server to create that experience for their tenants? Then we'll look into some more advanced capabilities that are possible using SQL Server Always On and Resource Governor. And at the end, I'll go over several common questions that often come up when talking about database as a service with Azure Pack. And then if there's still questions after that, I'm going to be hanging around, and I'm happy to answer them. You might have heard a little bit about Azure Stack yesterday in the keynote. I just want to be clear that we are talking about Azure Pack today. I want to talk to you guys about the technology that's available to you right now, in the sense that you could go home tonight, you could download WAP, you could download SQL Server Express, and you could have database as a service coming out of your hotel room tonight. And so just wanted to be clear about that. So how many people are familiar with the Azure Pack? Okay, so a good set of you. But I'll do a little overview just so that we're all on the same page. So the Azure Pack is a free download, so you can use Web Platform Installer to install the software. And it's a web portal interface and an API layer that goes on top of your existing infrastructure, your existing hardware. So it runs either on top of System Center or Windows Server, or in the context of today's conversation, it runs over your existing SQL Server instances. So here on the right is a diagram of kind of what comes with the Azure Pack. At the top, you have your admin and tenant portal. There are two portal experiences. The admin portal is where the administrator, of course, goes to manage their users, to create what we call plans, which explain how much the quotas that tenants can use when creating resources. And then you have the tenant portal. And the tenant portal is what we're saying is the Azure consistent portal, where you're coming and it looks just like Azure. A tenant comes to create a database, very similar experience from the one they'd have in the Azure database experience. And these portals are then on top of what we call the Service Management API. And so Azure Pack has both APIs and PowerShell. Has both APIs and PowerShell in case that you'd like to use that instead of using the portal. And you can always create your own portal experience on top of those APIs. And then these APIs are on top of what we call resource providers. And so this is where you really get into the plug-and-play model of Azure Pack, as you can have various resource providers. So for example, out of the box, you have the website's resource provider, databases, both SQL and MySQL, Service Bus, and you have the opportunity to create your own custom resource provider and plug it in if there's something that's lacking. What you're not seeing, which is very important, is IaaS resource provider, so a way for tenants to come in and have VMs on demand using the Azure Pack. And what to say about that is dependent on both System Center and Virtual Machine Manager running on top of Windows Server. And so if you are able to pair Azure Pack with Server and System Center, you're able to have a great IaaS infrastructure as well as use the automation capabilities of System Center. And we'll talk a little bit later about the automation. So what else about Azure Pack? Beyond all of that, beyond getting multi-tenant IaaS and PaaS, we also will do offer management. So you create these things called plans, as I mentioned, and that's how you determine what tenants can create using the Azure Pack. And then we'll track the usage. So for each tenant subscription, we will report how much that tenant used on their subscription so that you can later do billing and charge back. And then towards the bottom, we talked about how you can customize the portal in any way. There's also portal theming. So that's a little brief introduction to the Azure Pack. And then what exactly is database as a service? And so if you're here, I'm assuming you're interested in the concept of database as a service. We're in a world where everything is as a service. If you go into the Azure portal, there's so many things that tenants can just come and get on demand. And that's what they want. And so with database as a service, it's the idea, instead of thinking of, oh, I'd like to create a database, I'd like to create it on this server, it's looking at all of the database servers as if they're one cloud and saying, I want to create a database somewhere in the database cloud. I don't necessarily care too much about where it exists or what environment it exists in, but I just want it quickly. Keep going over there. So let's talk about this. Who wants this? So primarily the database consumer. So when I think of a database consumer, I'm thinking of an application developer or an application owner, someone who needs a data layer for maybe their web app or some application they're using within the organization. And it's really important to them because, well, it's on demand, so they don't have to go through a process of requesting a database, waiting for that approval to come through, and all of that. They can get it pretty quickly and easily. And we're seeing that innovation is going at such a speed that you might get application requirements in the morning, you're testing it in dev in the afternoon, and in the evening in its production. So to encourage speed like that, you really need to be able to get things exactly when you need them, and maybe even get rid of them when you're done using them. For the database consumer, it's also very simple. So today we'll see how the Azure Pack abstracts what's going on at the server level from the tenant who just needs the database. So they don't necessarily need to worry about patching and upgrading. In terms of something like HA, for example, they can get an HA solution without thinking about, oh, how did I create this always-on cluster, and all of those mechanics that go into managing a server. And lastly, it's cost-efficient for everyone involved in the sense that you're paying for what you use, you're paying for when you use it. If you have a day of high traffic, you can pay more for that day. But then if you have lower traffic, you don't have to worry about consuming too many resources. And on the other side, we think about why this is useful for a database provider. And so it's automated. So when you're using Azure Pack and if you set up, Azure Pack will take care of placing the databases. It'll take care of making sure no tenant is going over their quota. It'll take care of measuring their database usage. And a lot of that just gets automated for you. It's extensible, as we spoke about. So you can use the database RP, but then if you need other functionality like backup and restore or other functionality to complement it, you have that ability to use automation or use your own custom resource provider to bring that to WAP. And of course, it's billable, as I've been touching on. With the usage data, you can pair it with a chargeback solution, a billing solution, whatever you need. I do want to touch on the fact that there are a few options when you think of database as a service. It's not, and this is not necessarily a comprehensive list of options, and it's not saying that you have to choose one of these. Of course, all four of these could be existing in your organization at one point. But of course, there's the idea that there's private cloud or public cloud. We're very familiar with that. Certain applications are going to need to be run in the private cloud, hybrid cloud, whatever it is. But even then, when we think of public cloud versus private cloud, and private cloud I'm talking about Azure Pack here, there's kind of two ways you can choose to give database as a service to your tenants. There's SQL Server in a VM, which is not what I'm going to focus on today, but it is the idea that you're using IaaS, infrastructure as a service, to allow tenants to come get a VM on demand, and that VM has SQL Server on it. And so in that way, they are able to get access, on-demand access to databases, but they do have to manage the whole server. So it has pros and cons in that sense. Access to the full server, but then they have to know how to manage the full server. Or you have multi-tenant database as a service, which is what the WAP SQL resource provider does. And that is able to place multiple tenants on the same SQL server. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and show you guys what this looks like in the tenant portal. And then we'll talk about how we set that up. So I'm going to take the role of a tenant of Azure Pack. And so my administrator has told me some URL that I need to go to access the portal. And so in this case, I'm going to an instance of WAP called catalcloud.com. And when I get there, this is what I see. So this is asking me to authenticate to make sure that I do have access to the portal. And so what we've done here is this instance of WAP is being paired with a Fabricam AD, because I guess the company's name is Fabricam, and also Microsoft. So as a Microsoft employee, I'll go ahead and authenticate through here. And so I use my Microsoft credentials, and now I'm authenticated into the Azure Pack. And so what I'm seeing right now is the tenant portal. If you're familiar with Azure, this will look very similar to what you're seeing when you're going into the Azure portal. One difference is that if you're familiar with Azure, you see a ton of services on the left. It's like full of all these kinds of things that the tenant can create. And that's the subtle difference here, is that just unless my administrator gave me access to those services, I won't have access to them. I have to explicitly gain a subscription in the Azure Pack to actually be able to create certain resources. And so speaking of subscription, I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. And so what I do is I go to New, and I'm going to go ahead and create a subscription for myself. And so when I'm going to create a subscription, I see a bunch of plans that I have available to me. And presumably the administrator had created these plans. And so I have a whole list of ones I can choose from. I'm interested in getting the database plan. If I read the description, it tells me that I get access to create several different databases that are all created on SQL Server 2014. I can choose to create basic with SLA, HA, and I'll be billed separately for all the various types. So I'll go ahead and get my subscription. And now that I have my subscription, since I actually have multiple subscriptions, I'm going to choose to filter what I see in the portal to only be anything related to the subscription I just got. So it's telling me, OK, looks like you're new. You have a subscription. If I click on databases now, as you know, I did not create any databases, but now I'm going to go ahead and do that. And so this is showing an error. This is kind of the simple experience that the tenant has. So right from the bat, they have to go and give it a name. So let's pretend that I'm creating an app for Ignite. And so I'm going to call this the Ignite app database. And here it's asking me about something called an addition. And this is going to be really important as we look at the different ways you can offer database as a service. When I think about addition, I think of it as different flavors of database that you can create. And these were all specified by my administrator when they created the plan. So I can see that, like the description told me, I can create a small database, a basic one, or an HA, or one with SLA. So I'll just go ahead and select a small 1 gig database to start. And then it's going to ask me to specify an administrator name and password. And just to make sure that I don't forget the name, I actually will name it the name same as my database. And I will specify a password. And so it created the database. The reason I had to specify a username and password was for logging into my database later. So of course, I don't have the server username and password. I only am going to get a database on the server. But to log into that database and use the database at a later point, that's when I'll need these credentials. And so we'll see what's happening in the background, but we went and we created a database on SQL Server using those credentials. So as you can see, it's a pretty simple experience. It's pretty easy for the tenant. And there's a few things they can do here. So they can click on View Info. And here they can be reminded of the username that they gave to the database. They're informed of the server name. So this is the actual SQL server that my database lives on in my administrator's environment. And then I have my connection string here. So if I'm just building a web application, it requires a database connection string. I'm done. I have that. It's ready to go. I have my 1 gig database. I can start to use it in my web app using the connection string. And then there's a few other things they can do. For example, if I had forgotten my password, there is an option to remember it. Was there a question? Yeah. Yes, so we'll look at this later in the admin experience. So one thing you can do with WAP is you can allow tenants to create databases using Windows authentication, at which point they would have just typed in their username and the password would have been known when I was creating it. And I'll show you that when we look at the admin experience, how I can toggle that, but that's totally possible for database creation, SQL Auth or Windows Auth. And let's just see what the tenant experience is if I were to hop into Management Studio. So here I am in SQL Server Management Studio. It's going to ask me for the server name, which I saw when I looked at View Info in my WAP portal. Here it's asking me about SQL or Windows authentication. So if I had created a database using Windows Auth, of course I could do that, but I chose SQL Auth. And I'll just put in my credentials now. Ignite AppDB, that sounds right. Okay, and so now you can see I have some other connections, so if you just ignore those first two, but that third connection I have there on SSMS, or SQL Server Management Studio, this is me as my tenant. I have connected to just my database. And so if I open this up, I mean, this is all I can see of the server. If I open it up, all I see is databases. Usual server administrator sees all kinds of things, like they see their always-on management, resource governor management, anything else. But here, you're seeing the security isolation in the sense that I drop down databases, and all I'm seeing is the database that I created. And so, of course, I cannot see the databases that other tenants may have on the same server. And I can drop this down, and I can, create tables, run queries, whatever I need to do on my database as a tenant. And so I'm just going to disconnect. And let's go back to the portal. Oh, let's minimize this. OK. And so we looked at View Info. We looked at the database. Now let's look at something called resize. So I created my database, and I started using it. It's in my app. And now I'm realizing it's not large enough. It's not doing what it needs to do. I need to scale up my database. So I can come to the portal, and I can click on resize. And you can see, I can see a slider, but it's telling me that I don't actually have enough quota to do this resizing that I'd like to do. And so what we have in WAP is we have this concept called an add-on. So I have my subscription. That's all fine and good. But once I've used all the quota of my subscription and I'd like to get more quota, I need to get something called an add-on. And this concept also exists in Azure when you're trying to get additional features or additional capacity. So the way I do this is the same way that I got my subscription. It's that I go to my account, and under Add Subscription, I see Add Add-on. And here I would see a list of the add-ons that my administrator had created and made available to me. And for example, this is the only one that's available to me. It's pretty descriptive. It's telling me more capacity. And so now that I have the add-on and I go to resize my database, now I'm seeing it's actually possible. And so if I scale up and click OK, now my database has been enlarged, in fact, on the SQL Server. And so that was the tenant experience in a nutshell. Quick and easy. I picked an edition, created the database, and then I was able to start using it. So now we want to know, how did I actually set this up as the WAP administrator? Everybody with me? Any questions? Yes?
You have kind of, that all seemed very personal. Can you have like groups of users, like business units? So a business unit gets 100 gigs worth of database, and they can carve out.
Yeah, so what you can do in WAP is I created a subscription, right? And I can have co-administrators on that subscription. And so as a group, we could share that subscription. And so our administrator could have given us access to, 100 gigs. This business group gets to create 100 gigs of database. We'll share that subscription. We'll share access to those databases. That's why, for example, you saw that I had 4 subscriptions, because I might be part of like 4 different business groups, and I have my subscription for this and that's how you can kind of filter and keep track of what you're using it for. Okay, so looking at the admin experience, there's a few steps. So before you even connect to Azure Pack or even install Azure Pack, you're going to want to make sure you have your Fabric. And this honestly could mean just one SQL Server instance if you're just trying it out, or you have a very small environment. That's totally possible. But you are going to want to follow any SQL Server best practices for installing your SQL Server instances. And so once you have that, you're going to actually connect them to Azure Pack. And there's this concept called groups in the Azure Pack. And I think of these as just logical containers for your servers. And that's all they are. They don't have any technical or justification, but they're for you to group servers that are alike so that you can then use that in your offerings. So if I have 10 servers, 6 are just standalone servers, and 4 have always on enabled, I'm going to offer HA to my tenants. I'm going to want to create 2 groups, one for the regular servers and one for the HA servers, sorry, the always on servers. And this will help me when I create my plans. And so plans is something we've talked about. This is a concept in the Azure Pack. This is how I decide what tenants can create. And what I do is I map my plans to these groups, and I create something called an addition. And now we understand where this addition concept came from. It came from when I mapped, as an administrator, I mapped a plan to a specific set of groups. And finally, when I as the administrator is ready to have my plan be public, I make it public so that the tenant can come in and get a subscription to my plan and start creating databases. Yes? Yeah.
The Azure Pack.
Yeah.
What versions of which operating systems do you have? So does it have to be the Azure operating system? Can you just use Windows?
Sure. So Azure Pack itself will run on Windows Server as far back as Windows Server 2008 is supported and further up. And then you're going to connect that to then SQL Server, and that's the same story, actually as far back as SQL Server 2008 is supported and more recent. Okay, so let's actually take a look at what this admin experience looks like. Let's jump into that. Nope. Okay, so here we are in the tenant portal, and what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to jump to the admin portal. And let's look at this for a second. So if you're new to Azure Pack, you may have never seen this before, but we talked about how there are 2 different portals, one for the administrator to create plans, to manage users, and then the one that the tenant actually comes into to create new resources. And the first thing you're probably seeing is there's a lot more stuff here, and there's a ton more on the left. That's because I, as the administrator, I immediately have access to any resource providers that are in my environment. So like we said, out of the box, that means websites. That means IaaS. And I can go into there and I can connect to my infrastructure to enable these resource providers. Sorry. But I'm just going to focus on the SQL one today. And so if we go into SQL, we can see I've already connected to several servers. And what I'm going to do is the first thing I said I would do. Actually, before I connect to a server, I have to create a group, as we said. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to New, and I'm going to click on Create a Group. And it's going to show me this small wizard that asks me a few questions, and I'm going to just create a group. First, it's going to ask me if I'm using standalone servers or high availability servers. And so we'll start with the basic scenario of creating a standalone server group. And then it's going to ask me to name my group. So if we think about our plan, we gave tenants the ability to create a lot of 1 gig databases, but we didn't really give them the ability to create any larger databases. So I'm actually going to create a group just for that. So it's called Large Databases. I'm going to not use Resource Governor. We'll come back to that. And I'll go ahead and I'll create the group. It's created, and if we go to groups, we can see it right here, Large Databases. If I look, I can see there's no servers in it quite yet. So what I'll do is I'll go back to servers, and I'm going to go ahead and add a server to that group. So when I'm connecting my server to WAP, I choose which group I'm adding it to. And then I have to provide the server name. So this is not a friendly name. This is actually telling WAP what server you are connecting to. So this is assuming you already have the SQL Server installed in your environment somewhere. So I know that that's the name of my server. And I'm going to give my credentials. And a few things here. We talked about Windows authentication. That is not available on this step. So one prereq for connecting your servers to WAP is to make sure that SQL authentication is enabled on the SQL Server itself and that you have created an admin username and password so that WAP can connect to the server. And the other thing that's interesting is to talk about the size. So the size here is almost arbitrary in the sense that I get to choose that as the administrator. WAP is not going to go and check that that's the actual size of the server. And this is because you may have a server that has X amount of space, but you want a certain amount of the space of that to not be used for database as a service. You're using it for other tasks, and you need us to just not touch it. It's not there for tenant databases. So you can just tell WAP about a portion of your server, and that's the only, and we will not allocate beyond that amount, even if there is space. And so I'll just put an amount in there. A server cannot be allocated to more than one group, but one group can be in multiple editions using different plans. But it can always just be in one group. It's a one-to-one mapping. And I can show you that, yeah.
Sorry, quick one. What is that size? What does it mean? Does that mean data space? Does it take into account block space and backup space? Or, is that just for allocating data space?
That is just for allocating the database space. So that's a good point. So you would want to kind of plan ahead and think, okay, yeah, if the databases are able to take up this much space, how much can maybe their logs take up, or if you are backing them up. There's no backup support in this RP, but if you're doing that, then maintaining some separate space for that. So I've connected my server, and it's in a group. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it in a plan. Yep.
Yeah, I think just clarifying.
Yeah.
Because I didn't hear the entire question.
Oh, sorry. Yep.
Size is for just data, or does it include logs, backup, MDB, everything?
No, so size is for just the database. Yeah.
So you have to plan for.
Yes, because anything that is not done by the tenant in WAP is not accounted for in so backups are, if you're doing backups of the database somehow with WAP, that's out of band. We consider that an out of band operation, so we will not be accounting for that size here in our allocation algorithms. Yes.
Can you kind of customize this to include, the log size and the MDB size in some ways?
You kind of cannot.
I mean, if you look at it, somebody wants to migrate
Yep.
from their existing 2005 or 2008, like this needs to be created as a service. They would walk into it, they would enter their requirements saying, it's my data size, it's the log size, it's the growth, it's how much MDB space that I require.
Yeah.
And then I would expect a nice SQL Server coming up with that being.
Yeah, so he's asking is there a way to customize it so that you can say, oh, this is the size of my database, my temp DB, my log files, et cetera. And so that is not supported in our APIs as they are now in WAP. I mean, that's great feedback for our team. But when I say customizing, you could add custom fields technically in a custom portal when creating a database, but WAP will continue to create the database as that size and does not. This side is actually just data. So logs. So we can talk about this at the end with common questions, but that's just something we expect the administrator to be constantly monitoring and making sure they're not growing to any too large of a size. I'll just keep, if it's possible to keep some questions till the end, because I might cover them in common questions, but at the same time, if something's really, just speak up. Okay, so server and group, and then now the last step I need to take, so I've connected to my server, but I, as the administrator, the tenant has no way of accessing this server quite yet, until I actually create a plan. And so this is what we saw on that diagram. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go to plan and create. I did that a little fast. So what I did is I went to new, and there's several things available here as the administrator, and one of them is creating what is called a plan. And if I click on plan, I see that I can create a plan or I can create an add-on. We remember what add-ons are from the tenant experience. But what I'm actually going to do is create the plan, because the plan at the end of the day is what the tenant was actually going to subscribe to. And so when I go to create a plan, it's going to ask me to name it, of course. And so let's call this the Ignite plan. And then it's going to ask me what services would I like to offer in this plan. So when a tenant subscribes to this plan, what do they have access to create right off the bat? And it's only going to show me services that I have already configured. So I've already configured websites, for example. I've already configured my virtual machine clouds. I have yet to configure, but I will only include SQL servers in this plan. It's going to ask me if there are any add-ons that I'd like to associate with this plan, and I'm just going to not associate any add-ons for now. Yep. What was that?
Can you customize the add-ons saying that we can have our own add-ons included in that?
As the administrator?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, for sure. So the same exact flow that goes through when you're creating a plan, you pick the services, you pick the quotas for those services, is exactly what an add-on is. In an add-on, you go and you pick the services and you select quotas for those services. And then what you can do is you can link an add-on to a plan. And that's how you get the tenant experience of a tenant getting a subscription and afterwards adding an add-on. And so I have a ton of plans here, but I'm going to go ahead. Here I've found the plan that I just created. But as you can see, there's two things. It's telling me it's private. It's also telling me it's not configured. So this is a really important step that you want to make sure you don't skip before accidentally making the plan public. What this is saying is I've added SQL servers to my plan, but I haven't said how SQL Server is going to be consumed by the tenant. And to do that, I go in and to do that, I see what services I have, and I go ahead and I click on the one I'd like to configure. And once I'm here, I'm configuring my plan, and it's telling me I need to add a group to the plan. And so this is where I get to do a lot of the configuration and deciding what I'd like to do. So in my plan, this is where I'm going to create my additions, essentially. So for the addition I'd like to create an addition that allows you to create large databases. And it's going to ask me which of the groups would I like to create in the plan. So I'll pick large databases. It's telling me resource pool template is not applicable, and we'll get to that when we talk about resource governor. And then it's going to tell me what's the addition, like what do I want the customers to see when they come to create this database. And so this looks good. I'll just let them know. Actually, let's do too good. That it's of a larger size. And then this is where I'm setting quotas. So in this plan, when a tenant subscribes to this plan, how many databases are they allowed to create before they will stop being allowed to create it? And I'm going to say 10. It's a small plan. And each of those databases, what is the size? And like I said, we were going to go with 2 gigs. It's also, I get to determine here how much bigger those databases can grow with this number. So they're starting out as 2 gig. How much more can they grow when a tenant chooses to resize at a later time? And so, for example, I'll say that, they can double. But you have complete control over saying that, they can't go over a certain amount. And then here, I think you were asking before, this is where I can say that the database can be created using Windows Auth. I get a little warning that I cannot take this away from tenants once I've given it to them. Or I can leave it as auth, and tenants create their databases using SQL auth. And so once I do that, you can see I can actually add more groups. So this is how I have multiple additions in a plan. I can do standalone servers, and I can call it small database, 10 databases of this size. I can do whatever I'd like. I can keep adding groups as long as I have them. I can only add each group once, but for as many groups as I have, I can create multiple additions in my plan, and then I'll click Save, and my plan is now configured. And now the last step I have as administrator, it's just that it's telling me that the plan is private. So if a tenant, like when I signed in and I went into the portal and I saw a list of plans, I wouldn't actually see this one quite yet. But now I can just go to the bottom, say that I'd like to make it public, and now it's a public plan. So for example, if I go to my tenant experience now, and I'm trying to get another subscription, yeah, we can see that the plan now shows up, and the tenant is able to choose this and create their 10 databases that we gave them access to. And so that's really the admin experience, the few steps that there are. So you set up your SQL servers, you connect them to WAP, place them in groups, and then you create plans. And when you create plans is when you specify additions. And additions are what tenants see as the different types of databases that they can create. So let's talk about some of the more advanced capabilities. There's a few features that are really interested in SQL Server. They really can enhance your offering, and so we have them light up through Azure Pack as well. And the first one is SQL Server Always On. So Always On is a way to group servers such that you're not just relying on the database of one server, but you're actually having that database replicate across multiple servers. How they do this is you have multiple servers in one group. We call this an availability group, or SQL Server calls this an availability group. So for example, here's an availability group with 3 nodes. My first node, my first SQL server is read-write, so I can actually create databases on that server. And the other 2 nodes are read-only, so databases will be replicated on the other 2 servers, but you cannot write to those other 2 servers. My availability group has 3 nodes. They can have up to 9. Then the failover that occurs in case node 1 does have an issue, it goes down, you'll have automatic failover. You can also instigate as an administrator a manual failover. There's a ton of documentation and caveats or interesting things about Always On that I encourage you to look in the SQL Server documentation. And just one other thing is that it does have that dependency. It works hand in hand with Windows Server failover clusters. But the point being that if you do set up Always On in your environment and you have clusters ready and you do connect them to WAP, then WAP is able to create databases in the cluster so that they are replicated across the servers. And so we can actually take a look at how that works. So here I'm in SQL Server Management Studio. And I've already created my Always On cluster. So I follow the steps. I put them in a server failover cluster. I came into SQL Server. I created an Always On cluster. I'm not going to go through those steps, but they're well documented. And so if I open up my server, I can open up Always On, and I can actually look at the dashboard for my Always On cluster. And when I open up the availability group that this server is in, I can see the other servers that are also in my cluster. So my primary node is called Always On 1, but I am also in a cluster for Always On 2 and Always On 3. And I can even see that some databases have already been created, and you can see that they are completely synchronized. So for example, I have a database called DB2, and it was created on Always On 1, but then it was immediately synchronized to Always On 2 and Always On 3. And it lets me know that the data is completely synchronized across the servers. So that's what it looks like on the back end. When we think about what it looks like in WAP, again, the steps are the same. I start by creating a group, and all of this is actually already created. I've already created a plan for these. But the first step is to create a group. So here you see I have a group called High Availability. And when it asked me if it's a standalone server or a high availability group, I selected high availability. And in this group, I have one server. So when I connected my server to WAP, I connected the availability group listener, which is a always-on concept. And this is how WAP knows, after I connected to the listener, now WAP knows that it's dealing with an availability group. And you can see that here. It got the name of the availability group. And so if we just go look at our plans, if I go to my database plan, so here in my database plan, if I look how I've configured my additions, I can see that in that database plan, I configured an addition with the name High Availability Databases, and it was pointing to the High Availability group, and it had the same configuration as the other ones. You can create 5 databases of this size, and this is their maximum size. The caveat being that I have actually pointed it to an always-on listener. And so just to show you what's going on, what happens when a tenant goes to create a database, they may go to create an always-on database. So they give it a name, and here they're going to select the addition, but instead of selecting the first addition they chose, they'll just select one other addition. That's the only additional step for the tenant. And all other steps are going to be the same. They're going to have to specify a password and a username. And so it's telling me that my database is created as a tenant. And let's see what the administrator sees. As the administrator, if I go back to where I was looking at my dashboard, now we see, if everyone can see that, a new database has been created, not only on the server, but on all the other servers of the always-on clusters, pretty instantaneously. And so now the tenant has access to an HA database, and they really didn't have to do much more other than selecting a different addition in the dropdown. What? Not necessarily. So yes. So in that, yes, if you connect one listener, then tenants will share that listener in the same way that they share a server. You also have the option in WAP to connect to multiple listeners if you're having like a large environment. But it is a multi-tenant listener scenario. You have to, so, I'm sorry, I'll repeat questions. He asked me if you have to create a separate plan for each listener, and you do not. You do have to create a separate WAP group for each listener, because we'll just do a one-to-one mapping. Okay, this group of servers is for that listener group. But then you can have multiple groups in a plan. So a tenant can have access to create HA databases across various listeners if that's the scenario. Okay, great. Okay, so we talked about always on. We talked about how you can have high availability databases offered to your tenants. And let's talk about Resource Governor. Are people familiar with the Resource Governor feature? Okay, so I'll tell you about it. So SQL Server introduced a feature called Resource Governor in 2008, and it's been since improved in 2012 and 2014. And so this is actually a feature that us at the WAP team, we added this feature just this year, earlier in January, as part of our update roll-up cadence to the Azure pack. And so what does it mean? What Resource Governor is doing at the server level is it's going to limit resource consumption across CPU, across memory, across IOPS, so that no single database or no single request necessarily has access to all the CPU of the server or all the memory of the server, and so on. And so it's really powerful when you're thinking of a multi-tenant scenario, just like WAP is, in the sense that you can make sure that no tenant is using all the resources of the server, which you might be familiar with the noisy neighbor syndrome, or the idea that in a multi-tenant scenario, one tenant can take over a server, DOS the server, for example, to the detriment of others. And so this is really to avoid that. So databases start to get managed in the context of something called a resource pool, which is a resource governor concept. And instead of being managed in the sense of the whole server, so, oh, this database technically has access to all of the CPU of the server, you start to look at them as having access to only what's available in the resource pool. And how it works with WAP is that the administrator will go in and they will map resource pools with additions. So it all comes back to additions at the end of the day. Additions are really how you have tenants getting to different levels of service. Any questions on resource governor? Okay, great. So I'll just jump. Oh, perfect. We'll take a look at how this works in the portal, because there are several concepts that we've added to Azure Pack to support resource governance. And I will say a few items about the server requirements. Resource Governor is only supported on SQL Server 2014 and later. And this is because, as I said, SQL Server 2014 is when they added support for monitoring IOPS as well. And so to get the best of the feature, it'll be supported only on 2014. But there's nothing you really have to do on the server to enable this feature. You just have to connect a 2014 server to WAP, and you take a few steps in the admin portal, and then you will be able to use the features of this server in your offerings to your tenants. And so what are the steps, and what does it look like? So you can see here, let's look at that plan that I got before as a tenant. That last addition that I had seen was called Database with SLA. And that's, as you can see, that addition is pointing to a group called Resource Governed. And same quotas, 5 databases of the same size. But it's just pointing to a different group of servers, which is an important thing to keep in mind. And so if we go look at what that group of servers is, if I click on Resource Governed, I can see which servers are in that group, as we did before, and I can see it's a server called SQL 2014-3. And if I dive in, I can really get an idea of what is going on this server. I can see the capacity that's left on the server, the amount of CPU, memory, IOPS, resource pools. Actually, let me show you connecting to it. So I just want to show you this step, because if we go back to the step of registering a hosting server, when I had to choose a group, as you can see, if I choose a regular group that doesn't have Resource Governor enabled, it's just going to be a one-page wizard. It just needs the information that we previously discussed. As soon as I choose a Resource Governor enabled server, it's going to, as you can see, it adds another page. It needs more information from the administrator. So it might complain about this. Yeah, let's see. Okay. Fortunately, I can't show it to you because I've already connected to all the SQL servers I know about. But what it would ask me is, what is the total CPU cores on the machine? What is the total memory on the machine? What IOPS are available on that machine? And how many resource pools would I like to limit being created on that machine? Because we are going to go ahead, Azure Pack is going to go ahead and actually create the Resource Governor resource pools on the SQL server at the time of database creation. And so that's why you're going to want to tell us what this machine is capable of in terms of capacity, but also in terms of resource pools. And so what was interesting we would have seen is we even limit that to 18, because the SQL Server recommendation is as soon as you exceed 18 pools on one server, you start to see performance issues. But it's completely up to the administrator. Do they want to keep that at 18, or do they want to have that be, a lower number if they're concerned about any performance issues? And so that's how I got this dashboard here. When I had connected this server, for example, I had not only said what the capacity of the server is, but I had specified cores, memory, IOPS, and the amount of resource pools I want to be created on the server at any point. And so, okay, so I've connected my server, and you guys know that the next step is to go ahead and create a plan. But there's one other thing I need to do here, because I need to specify what these resource pools are that are going to be created. Otherwise, WAP has no idea. And the way you do that is you create something called a resource pool template. And this is sort of like a cookie cutter that the administrator creates, and you say, always use this template to create the resource pools you're going to create. And you can create as many of these as you want, depending on the various offerings you'd like to have for your tenants. So I've already created one, just to save a little bit of time. But we can go ahead and see what I created that as. So I had given it a name. I had called it SLA Resource Pool. And it was asking me for minimum and maximum CPU, min-max memory, min-max IOPS, and so on. This is basically saying, for a database that is created in this pool, what do they have access to? And so we talk about SLA because I've specified minimums. So by using this feature, any database created in this pool will definitely have access to, for example, 0.3 CPU cores or 512 megabytes of memory. And at the same time, if there's no competition for the resources on the server, they'll be able to go up to this maximum level. And so you really can get really granular about what tenant databases have access to on the server without necessarily worrying about resource pool placement, because that will happen from WAP. Okay. Yeah, so he was asking if it's at the database level, the ones that were created in WAP, or versus just ad hoc users that are on the same server. And so it will still, the way Resource Governor works is when a database is created using Resource Governor, it's placed in an explicit resource pool that is named and created by WAP. For those who are not using Resource Governor and a database is created on the server, they're placed in sort of like a default pool. And so what happens is the ones in the resource pool will still always get their promised SLA, no matter what these other ad hoc databases, they might have access to a ton of things, but they will still be throttled because another database is in a resource pool.
Within the same database, you've got the application
With,
from the front end, but then you've got some operational reporting, people running ad hocs against that same database.
Oh, yes.
Not always tuning it before they run it.
Right. So within the same database, it cannot do, it can't do too much. Yeah, sorry, yeah. It can only limit, I'm gonna get logged out. Let's see if it logs me back in. But you can only kind of limit the resource consumption at the tenant database level. I'll take another question while this, did you have another question? That is what we're doing on the back end, if that's what you're asking. Yes. Yeah. Right. So yeah, once your subscription is associated to a pool, you will be funneled to that pool. But if your another subscription was funneled to another pool, if that makes sense. Did everyone get? Okay. Sorry. Okay. So we were looking at the resource pool templates. So we talked a little bit about the CPU, the memory, the IOPS. And of course, all of this there's so much, not so much, but there's great documentation about the resource governor feature in general available from the SQL Server team, where you can go and you can read about, as was mentioned, the classifier function and what is going on the back end to create these resource pools, what these numbers mean. But at a high level, we try and bring as much as necessary for the administrator into the admin portal. Then there's something called maximum subscriptions per pool. So this can be anywhere from 1 to some very, very large number. So if I put this at a large number, I'm sort of fixing the noisy neighbor syndrome because I'm putting in at least I'm creating a resource pool for my tenants, but I'm still having multiple tenants share one resource pool. So that it's really up to you as the administrator. Maybe you have a bunch of them sharing a resource pool that still has its benefits. But if you were to put one subscription per pool, it's truly a way to provide an SLA for that subscription because they are going to be the only people having access to that resource pool. And then there's a second page. I don't know if you can see this. I apologize, but there's just a lot of other granularity for the administrator when they're creating these pools. These are all derived directly from SQL Server. Each of these is a different setting you can set when you create the pool. So we've tried to give you defaults where possible, but this is totally something the administrator might be interested in setting for resource pools as well. So maximum memory per request, the maximum time per request, and so those are there as well. And so coming back to why we created resource pool templates, so you needed to come here and you needed to create a different template for each type of pool you'd like to offer to your tenants. So maybe you have a resource pool template for a small pool that doesn't have access to too much CPU, and you have a different template for a larger pool that has more access to more CPU, or whatever it is, however you'd like to differ them. I, for example, just have 2. And then what I do is when you go to create the plan, I can even just show how that looks. Let's maybe take some existing plan. Let's take that Ignite plan I created. So we created this Ignite plan before, and we added a certain group, and we gave it an addition name. And now I'd like to add a resource governor enabled group as well. So again, when I go to add the addition, I'm going to choose my group. I'll pick resource governed. It holds my server that has this feature enabled. And then it's going to ask me to pick a resource pool template, and I'm going to map it with the group. So this is the template we just looked at. And then it's going to ask me to name the addition for my tenants. It's the same one I gave to the other, and then similar steps. And of course, I can allow, disallow Windows auth. It's an orthogonal matter. But just this is exactly where you're going to, not only are you saying additions are mapping to SQL groups, but you're also mapping those with the resource pool template that we would like to be used when databases are created in this addition. Yeah. No, that is a great. That's unfortunately something that we just didn't get to. Having that ability to add an add-on that allows you to move resource pools, it's definitely. I could see why that would be a good idea, but that's just not possible. Changing resource pools. The only way to do that would be to kind of have the administrator manually do it, but not through WAP. And so, just to show you guys how this works, I'll go back into my tenant experience. And I'm actually going to create a resource governor database. So I'll call it Ignite app DB RG. Actually, that's really long. Ignite RG. And I have to choose an addition again. And so I'll choose the one that looks attractive. It's telling me I get an SLA with this database. So let's see what that's all about. And I'll go ahead and I will create the database. And so there we go. My database is created. Again, super simple. It didn't require any more steps on my part to actually create this database. But we can go in we can log in as the tenant and we can see what the implications are for the tenant, what this means for them. So I'm going to go into SQL Server Management Studio. I'm going to exit out of here. And what I have here is I've already connected as a tenant to another resource governor database. And I did that before just for the purpose of this demo. So that's already happened. And now I'm also going to connect to the database that we just created here as a group. And so we can go to that database, and we can see what the server is. So the server is SQL 2014-3, and the name of the database, as well as the administrator, is Ignite RG. So I will just put in what the information needed here, just to log into my database the exact same way that I had before. And so now I'm logged in, and this is what I want to show you. I want to show you what happens when two tenants are going to hit their database with a really intense CPU query. So we can see how different tenants end up getting throttled to allow other tenants with their CPU-intensive query. And so what I have, okay. So what I have is I just have this. It really doesn't do anything other than take up a lot of CPU. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to end up running it from both of my tenant databases. And we're going to watch how their CPU changes for each of these databases. And we can do that if you guys are familiar with using Performance Monitor. Performance Monitor allows you, it's on the Windows Server. It allows you to monitor lots of different metrics of server. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for, in Performance Monitor, I'm going to actually look for the resource pools that have been created. And here I see I'm clicking on SQL Server Resource Pool Stats, and it's showing me a list of the resource pools that exist on this server. And we didn't get to look at this in the portal, but if we had looked in the portal, these two pools at the top are actually the pools that were created for the two tenant databases. And this is all information that is in the WAP admin portal. So, oh man, hold on, let me do this again, sorry. I selected one too many. All right, let's start that over. Sorry, guys. I accidentally clicked on all of the features. I really just wanted to look at CPU usage. Otherwise, we would have seen way too much data than was really interesting. So I'll do that now. I'm going to explicitly click on CPU usage, and I'm going to select the two resource pools that I'm interested in monitoring. And now I can see I'm only monitoring two fields, not the whole crew like last time. I'm going to take that out. And so we're monitoring CPU usage of our two resource pools. Right now, there's nothing much going on and interesting. Neither of the tenants seem to be using their databases quite yet. And what I'll do is this database we just created, we're going to start running our app. We're going to start hitting it with a large load. I'm going to hit execute on the CPU intense query. And immediately we see the CPU usage is shooting up. And it's shooting up to that maximum value that we determined when we created the resource pool template. As you'll remember, we said that at a max, this is the CPU usage that this database can use. And so that's where it's being allowed to run. Now, if I come in as the other tenant and I also start executing a lot of CPU, we immediately see now the first tenant was throttled, but they weren't throttled to 0. They weren't throttled to some arbitrary number. They're actually throttled to their minimum guaranteed value. And what we're seeing here is I used the same resource pool template for both of these databases, so that's why they're meeting kind of at halfway. They're both being forced to run at that level. And it looks like this. one of them actually, what happened here is one of the databases actually stopped running, and so the other one went right back up to its maximum. And so that's just kind of showing you what's going on in the background with Resource Governor. Do you guys have any other questions? That was actually the final demo before I get into common questions. Yes?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, yes. Oh, sorry.
So does it do any capacity management? So if you've got 3 servers in a group, does it kind of know how to load balance new databases across those? Or like,
Oh, I see.
you've got a pool of servers, right?
Yeah,
One
yeah.
might be quiet.
Right, so I created a pool of servers to attach to WAP. I created them, put them in a group, and I put them in WAP. And actually, this is one of the things I was going to talk about. WAP will, it's not really going to, two different things. Let me go ahead to that question. I'll come back. So when we talk about the allocation algorithm, if you were using non-resource governor, if you were just connecting to regular servers, high availability servers, we're going to go ahead and place the database on the server that has enough capacity, of course. But something that kind of maybe trips people up is we are going to fill a server up before allocating to a new server. So in that sense, it may seem like it's not necessarily load balanced. We will fill up a whole server before going to another server in the group. And this is because we want to have the administrator, we want them to have the easiest way to move servers in rotation. If one group is getting way more load than they really thought from tenant databases, they can easily take a server and take it out of rotation. So that's the intention there. We've had feedback saying both. But what is different is when you use Resource Governor, because Resource Governor is a little different. So with Resource Governor, all databases for one subscription end up being created on the same server because subscriptions have that one-to-one relationship with the resource pools. Because of that, you end up seeing them being spread a little bit more evenly because we will save so much space on one server with the assumption of this is how much space the tenant really has access to. And so we'll easily end up creating them evenly on the other Resource Governor servers in the group. Yeah?
Yeah, no questions. To expand on his question, you said that you fill up the server. You fill it up to 100%, or is there a way to cap it to say 80% or 20% growth? Or?
There's not a way. We fill it up right up to that capacity that you provided when you added the server to WAP. Okay. Yeah. And of course, we won't, I mean, it might not fill it up completely. It depends on how the database requests come in and in what order. But ideally, we are filling it up all the way to that capacity that was specified.
And the follow-up question is regarding AD. How's this interface with AD? And more specifically, I guess I was asking about service accounts, but that's more about provisioning.
Sure. So we do integrate with your local AD. Actually, if you stay behind, we can even chat about that because one of my teammates is here who can definitely get it. Yeah. So just common questions about the SQL resource provider. Does it require System Center? It does not. So just to be clear, System Center is what you'll be using for if you want to do monitoring or automation. But to do database as a service, or for obviously infrastructure as a service, but for simple database as a service, it's just going to be WAP on top of SQL Server. Actually, I'll just go through these real quick and then I'll take questions. We talked about this. We talked about the different versions of SQL that are supported. So all the way back to 2008 SP3. You do want to keep in mind that you're using 2012 for HA, that you're using 2014 for Resource Governor. And of course, I said you should have SQL authentication. Make sure that you have that enabled on the server because as you saw, WAP asks for that. We talked a little bit about the allocation algorithm. And I'm sorry if I went through that a little fast, but I do want to make sure I get you guys out on time. In terms of monitoring, how can you monitor your environment? So if you do have System Center You can use Operations Manager, so this is part of System Center. It's generally a tool for monitoring. I bring it up because there are certain management packs that you can use in Operations Manager. You can use the Windows Azure Pack Management Pack. That'll tell you, it'll give you kind of details about the resource pools you've created, when they're running at it, like if a tenant database creation fails for some reason that has something to do with the way the resource pools were created, that's where you'll see those types of alerts. And you can also use the SQL Server Management Pack to get more specific server alerts, maybe before they arise through WAP. In terms of how can I automate my environment, and I'm sorry that I'm rushing through this, but there's another tool also in System Center called Service Management Automation. So this is something that if you're running WAP on top of System Center, you can use this. We call it SMA. SMA is great. You write something called, you use PowerShell workflow to write something called runbooks that can do anything that you can basically do in PowerShell, you can now automate it. So we talked about adding servers to groups, adding groups to plans. You can automate that whole thing if you need to. We talked about going and having to manage transaction logs after the database is created. You can automate that experience too. You can have that run once a day. So a lot of the routine steps that an administrator might have to take can actually be automated. And I'm happy to chat about SMA a little bit more after if people have questions. A good place to start would be to try the out-of-box sample that comes with downloading WAP, which is called Sample Managing SQL Servers. Just to talk about other database providers, we focused on SQL today, but out of the box, Azure Pack also comes with a MySQL resource provider. And a lot of what we talked about today, SQL groups, SQL additions, is the exact same in our MySQL resource provider, if that's of interest to you. There's also, if you're going to go with a SQL and a VM approach, you're going to have your tenants create VMs with a full VM. Also with WAP, there's an Oracle template, and I'm sure there's other templates available. And of course, if neither of these providers, there's another provider you're interested in, you can always create a custom resource provider in WAP. And then what about Azure Stack? So that's the only thing I wanted to say. This was, as I said in the beginning, we're focusing on Azure Pack today, focusing on things that you can use right now. You can go have it in your environment ready to go. And Azure Pack is going to be continuously supported and enhanced through 2017 in the sense that several of the features we talked about today actually have only come in the last year because we've been getting a lot of customer requests. People said they needed Windows auth for database creation and so on. So I encourage you to let us know if there's anything that's missing. Or in summary, you can use the Azure Pack to provide database as a service with SQL Server. The administrator creates the different options for their tenants via using something called additions. You can integrate with other products that I just discussed, such as SMA, Operations Manager, and way more for a better experience. And there's support for Windows auth, contained database creation, always-on resource governor, and I say and more in the sense that if there's something we're missing, then do let us know. I have some links up here to learn more about the Azure Pack. So if you're new to Azure Pack, there's a product overview. Please go to that second link to give us feedback on our user voice site. We monitor it a lot to see what features you find are missing. Some information on our partners. We have a lot of third-party partners who provide billing and chargeback solutions. They provide request management solutions, VMware, VM creation, the list goes on. Specifically about the SQL RP, if you leave out here and you have more questions, we of course have our product documentation online. I'm really excited to announce the SQL MVA. We have a course online that you can do that is public today, so you're the first to know about that. So that's up there. It's a lot. I gave the course. It's a lot of the same content you heard today, but just for reiteration. And then we have a great white paper written on our database as a service solution that I encourage you to look at, to spread it, to share within your organization as you consider this. And finally, well, not finally, but do take note of these. These are our upcoming sessions. There's a lot of information about Azure Pack for the rest of the week, some information about Azure Stack. If you're interested in IaaS, if you're interested in identity, there's a bunch of sessions that you should take note of. As well as sessions, there are labs. There'll be an instructor-led lab on Thursday, and there'll be several hands-on labs. I'm a huge fan of the hands-on labs. It's the best way to learn WAP. You're getting right in there, and you're going through the steps yourself, some of the ones I went here, so you can really feel a little bit more confident that you've learned how to use the portal. And I just have two more things. The first is that there is an Ignite Azure Challenge, so you guys rock for sticking around till the end of the day. I'm so appreciative. You've earned this. You should go to aka.ms, my Azure Challenge, and you should enter that session code because it will enter you into a raffle for a Surface Pro 3 or Microsoft Band, tons of cool stuff that you earned your raffle ticket in. So the session code is 3EMT. Give you guys a second. And I can come back to this. And then finally, of course, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate any of your feedback about this session. I also will appreciate, you guys should come up, ask me questions, give me feedback. And please do evaluate the session online. And that's it. Thank you guys. Thank you.